Hey everyone, I would like to introduce you to Monster Hunter World. Just a quick little bit about the game. It did come out back in January 2018, and then in over those 6 years of continued development, continued support, I think it still holds up very well into 2024. And with Monster Hunter Wilds being announced and released sometime in 2025, I thought it may be a good idea to help those new to Monster Hunter get familiar with this game. And then the reason I chose to make a video about World rather than Rise is I believe Wilds is to be like the successor or follow up to World. And while Rise is the most recent entry to the series, it does have its own style that doesn't really correlate with World and not much with Wilds, at least from the little I've seen from it. Now, why do I think Monster Hunter World is a good game? Well, I like to think that the gameplay itself is very engaging, diverse, and offering different play styles and then for different players as well. The replayability of the game also can't be mistaken, as with 250 hours on the game, I can still find myself going back to play it. Whether that's hunting a monster I don't really hunt that often, hunting a monster that I've had trouble with, trying out a new weapon, as there are 14 different weapons, which I will go over here in a bit. The game does have a lot to offer with its gameplay, crafting mechanics, the monsters themselves, hunting those monsters. The setting of the game is also pretty vast, with 5 areas in the base game, and then 2 more with the Iceborne DLC. When on the quest or expedition, there are 2 parts to the hunt when you're out there. So the first one is like looking for clues, tracking that monster that you're on a quest for, and then actually when you find it and start fighting it. So I like to divide that up into 2 pieces. And then there are plenty of other aspects to the game outside of quest I gotta keep in mind of, as it helps you continue to grow as a hunter, whether that be the crafting system for new weapons, armor sets, farming for important crafting resources, and then other miscellaneous items to help you throughout the game. And then Monster Hunter World is a progression-based game on gear rather than leveling system. The only levels you really find in the game is on the armor rating and the hunter rank, which the hunter rank just shows how long you really played the game for. Apart from that, once you kind of meld a lot together and really get into it, you can sink a lot of hours into this game. Now, as much as I do love this game, I can't deny it has its flaws, has its issues, much like any other game. There also is what I think could be a little bit of a buried entry, especially for those new to the series, that can deter them. For someone who hasn't played any of the Monster Hunter games, the gameplay can seem clunky, slow, especially if you choose one of the slower weapons to begin with. And then the graphics to the game aren't also the best. They aren't stunning to look at or anything like that, but it does have its charm. And then experiencing the game can depend again on that weapon and the playstyle that you choose, or the player themselves, whether they're open to changing around their playstyle. The game itself also has a pretty slow start, especially as you kind of wander around in the very beginning half of the game, as you're not really free to do as you please until later on. But the developers did introduce a way to kind of help speed up your progression throughout the game and try to reach that Iceborne DLC, and that would be through the Defender set of armor and the Defender series of weapons, just kind of help speed through the game. Now, the narrative you're also given in the game, it's just kind of there. It's kind of really give you details of what's going on, but it's not really something super important that you got to keep track of. Throughout the story, it's kind of more the same. I was like, hey, there's a new monster, now go and stop it, right? Kind of deal. I mean, that's the whole point of the game. And then with such a high variety of different weapons, armor sets, you can get overwhelmed in the beginning, especially choosing what to craft, what element to choose for the weapon, if you choose one at all, the perks and abilities you get from the armor pieces. But overall, like first starting out, that doesn't really matter a whole lot. That only comes into play later on in like late game. So you have plenty of time to eventually learn that kind of deal. But for some people, that may not be an option because they just don't have that kind of patience, which I get. And then the world itself is pretty big. It's pretty vast in my opinion. It's got a whole ecosystem, a lot of monsters you got to learn about. But I don't think you should let that intimidate you from giving the game an honest try. There are a total of 14 weapons, as I mentioned earlier, all with their own playstyle and methods of use. Each one fulfills a different role, especially when you're hunting with a party or when you're hunting solo. Now, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of depth about each of those weapons, but I am going to give a brief description about each. So you have your longsword, which is mostly about your flow of your attack chains. It's about medium speed, decent mobility. Does focus a lot on counters and combos. It is an easy weapon to pick up, but it does have a high skill ceiling to master. Then you have your greatsword, which is your heavy hitting, slow, big blade. It's more using with calculating, especially with like veteran players, because you have to know how the monster is going to hit and where it's going to hit, just because of how slow it is, and you got to really make your attacks count. Then you have your dual blades, which are fast, light hitting twin blades with a different effect on them as well, called demon mode, which helps increase your damage, but kind of like prolongs your animation duration and drains your stamina a lot quicker, kind of leaving you more vulnerable to attacks. Then you have my favorite, the bow. It's a ranged weapon, but it's more best used at close range to get that damage in. It's got pretty good movements, high mobility, but it does have the trade-off of low defense. That just means you're just taking less hits than you would as another player would. Then there's the charge blade. It has two modes. The first mode is like a sword and shield kind of style, and then it transforms into a big axe just for more range and more damage. It's a very technical weapon. It does take a lot to kind of get used to and master, but it's pretty decent. Then we have the insect glaive. Now the glaive has great mobility, allows you to jump up in the air and just kind of like fly around, kind of like a helicopter, and hitting the monster. Now while in the air with your aerial attacks, you don't do as much damage as you would do on the ground. Now the insect glaive does have another feature to it called the Kinsect, which you can use for buffs as you would send it out to attack the monsters, and they can apply their own statuses as well, just depending on which Kinsect you choose. Now next is the heavy bow gun. It's got low movement capabilities, but kind of like handles like a cannon, dealing a lot of damage, especially with hard-hitting shots. But it's nothing too crazy or special. It's just kind of like there to be like the heavy weapon. Then you have your switch axe. Now this weapon is similar to the charge blade, as it can transform from an axe to a sword, with your axe being decent range, decent damage, and decent mobility. And then the sword also has decent range and much more damage capabilities, but is slower moving. Then we have your sword and shield, which is your standard basic weapon, really good for beginners. It's really quick, does decent damage, does the slash damage and the KO damage as well with the shield. So it's a pretty good overall pick, especially for newer players. Then we have the light bow gun, opposite to the heavy bow gun. It aims to be a little more quick moving and a little more faster hitting, but again, the bow guns aren't nothing too special. Kind of like fill that role for like the COD player, really. Then we have the gun lance, which is similar to the lance, which I'll go over shortly. The gun lance leans into more attacking than defending. It still pokes, and then it has a short range capability as well. But when I say short range, I mean short range. You have to be in the face of the monster still. Then we have the hunting horn, which is a support weapon, provides buff, especially when you're playing with other players or the hunters or your friends or whatever. provides those buffs by playing songs, and you would play those songs as you kind of like attack and just play different melodies to get out different buffs. A little more of like needs to be a party kind of weapon, kind of hard to use when you're solo, but still doable. And lastly, we do have the Lance, which focuses on defensive ability to guard and counter attack against monsters. It's more really just to kind of take that monster head on and just kind of hold them in place. Now, as we go into the monsters of the game, I think they're very well designed. They have a huge amount of thought that went into that design. They have a really good mix of realism and fantasy. Some monsters might have more than the other, but that's okay. It gives that game the charm. But also makes the world that much more believable and fantastical at the same time, if that makes any sense. And then the base game has a total of 34 monsters that you can hunt. And then with the Iceborne DLC, it adds another 26 monsters. Although a few of those that were numbered are just variants of the same monster, so the actual number of monsters is a little less than I mentioned. But overall, I really do love this game. It's really fun. I enjoy it a lot. From the gameplay, to the hunts, to designs of monsters, the world itself, containing that really nice mix of realism and fantasy, giving it its charm. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. If you guys don't mind, just hit that subscribe and share. I'd really appreciate that.